Here is the technique. I take a little pigment, some blue pigment. There, I draw a line with some zigzags like this. I leave a part diagonally like that. I rinse my brush. I blot it lightly. And then I go over the edge with the tip on the blue part and the rest on paper. And what happens is that I create a mountain with one side a little darker and the other side a little lighter. And this technique is incredible because it allows you to create amazing effects in a single wash. Let's do another example. I'll take some cobalt turquoise with some yellow. That will make me a green. Well saturated, I take more pigment, add some more, really put a lot, even some more water. I'm adding, so I create a very pigmented horizontal area, and then I rinse my brush, sponge my tip, and look at what happens. Here, there's an area that I haven't completely filled in yet, but there, you see, I do the same thing again. I rinse, I lightly dab. And I release the pigments. And do you see the effect it creates? It's like having a lawn with trees in the wet. And finally, we can make a last application. I take a little bit of the greenish yellow ochre, and here I will create. There. A ball that shrinks, I rinse my brush, I blot it, and then I create a kind of pear. I'm going to take a little bit of black to create the tip. From there, you see that with this technique that softens the various edges you can see. You can create in a single pass objects with relief, relatively angular objects by keeping a relatively clean edge. You can create complete landscapes in a single pass with some grass here and vegetation in the distance, with trees in the distance. And you can even create the rounded shape of an object, like here, our pear. And all this is made possible by the same technique that consists of creating a line, for example, and then I take my brush, dab it slightly, and run it over this. Between the painted area and an area of white paper. And this will soften my edges. And just by doing this, you see, I feel like I have a base that blend slightly on the water. So this technique is extremely powerful, but on the other hand, it requires skill in pigment dosing, which is relatively important. And to help you here, you have 3 possible applications when you soften an edge. The first application is that of a mountain, is to have a relatively dry painting area. So you take pigments, but without too much moisture. That way you have an area that is not too wet here. So when you go over with your rinsed and dabbed brush, the edge will stay relatively sharp. Like here, the other effect you can create is when you use a lot of water. There, if you remember well, I had added a lot of pigment, lots of water, lots of pigment, lots of water. With water, and then I rinse my brush. I put a little less moisture. I soften the upper edge, which causes the pigments to move upward. And finally, at the level of the pear, here it is. A moderate humidity on the paper, so that when I brushed over it with just water, the edge softened and the pigments slightly migrated. So depending on the water that is on the first area where you apply, the pigments will more or less migrate. And however, there is a mistake that should not be made. It is to put much more water on the second pass than on the first pass. Because here, for example, I take ultramarine blue with some earth tone and create a stroke like this. If I rinse my brush, but don't blot it. I rinse my brush, there is a lot of water. Then from there, I try to soften my edge. You'll see what happens. Well, you see there, it is already starting to create halos. because the fact that there's a lot of humidity on the second pass will cause the water to rise. In the first area, and since the first area is less humid than the second area, there will be more chances of creating halos. This is the kind of thing that happens mostly on cellulose paper, which is why I constantly encourage you to use 100% cotton paper instead. With 100% cotton paper, you will find it much easier to create these edge softenings, whereas on cellulose paper, it is still more difficult. So here, I did it for you on cellulose paper, but it requires a dosage of water and pigments, which is millimetric. So what I invite you to do is have fun making mountain chains, for example, like this. I don't have much space here, but it's okay. Hop, you make a first mountain like here, you do a second one like here, and you can do them one after the other and see what happens. And little by little, you'll start to see the right pigment dosage to adopt in order to create this, or this effect. This technique, which allows to soften an edge, I use it all the time in my watercolors. It is also one of the most powerful that I know. At the same time, to give an impression of relief in a single wash on objects that are relatively angular or on objects that are rather spherical, but also to create complete landscapes by letting the pigments diffuse from the wettest area to the least wet area. So now it's starting to dry. You can see the effect it creates. So don't forget that you have to always have a brush on the second pass with less water than on the first pass.